Hi, I'm Thomas Bowles, Prince William County Agricultural Extension Agent. Welcome to our video. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this week's class on the planting and care of trees. Our speaker tonight is Jan Rice. She is a master gardener here in Prince William County, and she's going to take us through dealing with our trees.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Joyce Kilmer, the poet, once wrote, "I think that I shall never see a poem lovely as a tree." But poets, artists, scientists, and writers have been inspired by trees for centuries. Today, we're going to take a look at a few awe-inspiring trees before we talk about selecting, planting, and caring for trees in our own backyards. I'm going to talk a lot about native plants today, but before we do, let's talk a little bit about trees. Trees are amazingly adaptive creatures. If they're densely planted, they will just create smaller canopies. If they're planted in better soil, they have larger root systems. If they have less light, they produce thinner leaves. They just adapt to where they are. They are the longest living life form, and some have lived for thousands of years. Probably not the ones in your neighborhood, but they are amazing. They have existed for 370 million years. And trees store 80% of the live carbon in the world. Their tree rings record climate changes throughout history. They are the structure of our garden. While the perennials and annuals are beautiful, we can move them around, but the trees are the backbone. So here's the oldest living tree that we know of. It's a bristlecone pine in the White Mountains of California, and it's over 5,000 years old. And there's a yew in Wales that is estimated to be 4,000 years old. It's believed to have taken root in Britain's Bronze Age. In comparison, the oldest animal is an 183-year-old tortoise, and the oldest human has lived for 122 years. So we're humbled by trees. Now, these are clonal colonies. A clonal colony is a group of trees that's genetically identical and has a single root system. This is the Pando or trembling giant, the one on the left. It contains 40,000 individual quaking aspen and is located in Fish Lake National Forest in Utah. This clonal colony is estimated to be 80,000 years old. And on the right, this Norway spruce is in the Swedish mountains, and it's estimated to be 9,550 years old. And it's the only living trunk of an ancient clonal colony. Some of the tallest trees, one is in the redwood forest in California. It's called the Hyperion. And the Centurion is a mountain ash in Tasmania, Australia. Both these trees are taller than the Statue of Liberty, which tops out at 305 feet. So a couple of other large trees are the General Sherman, which is a giant sequoia in Sequoia National Park. Its trunk volume is estimated to be over 52,000 cubic feet. And this Montezuma cypress in Oaxaca, Mexico, is estimated to be between 1,200 and 3,000 years old. Its trunk circumference is 138 feet, and its diameter is 46 feet. Now, you can Google famous trees in history and come up with all kinds of trees. I chose these three, the first one, because as many of us have been kept inside by the pandemic, you can empathize with Anne Frank watching out of her attic window, this beautiful whitehorse chestnut tree. It did blow down in 2010, so it's gone, but the trees germinated from its chestnuts have been planted around the world. And Sir Isaac Newton sat under this tree in 1666, musing about natural forces. It blew down in 1820, but as you can see, it did not lose its root system, and it regrew and is alive today. And this oak tree is in Hampton, Virginia. It's at Hampton University in Virginia. And this is a tree where slaves gathered in 1863 to hear the Emancipation Proclamation. I'm always awed by trees that live this long. And there are so many to choose from. So why do we plant trees? Because trees provide habitat for birds, mammals, and insects. Trees create beauty and contribute to our health and well-being. And without trees, Earth would be pretty much uninhabitable. Trees are an investment in our future. When you plant a tree, you may not live to see it through its full lifespan, but you know you've planted something for the future. So I wanted to mention a little bit about forest succession, because humans, I think we tend to think we are much more in control of things than we are. But if a farm field is abandoned or you were to stop mowing your lawn, first the grasses and weeds would grow tall, and then small trees and shrubs would begin to sprout. And then larger hardwood species would grow between the smaller trees. And in just a few years, you would have the start of a forest. Now, during the life of a forest, fire, wind, or ice can bring down trees and create gaps when the forest will then return in those spaces to its earlier stages, but it starts all over again with the grasses, the smaller trees and bushes, and finally the hardwoods. And different stages in a forest's growth provide different habitats for different forms of wildlife. And I'm particularly fond of this little picture on the bottom left, which has a tiny little oak that is trying to grow beside a roadside underneath a roadside barrier. Trees are amazing. And this I won't go into too deeply. This is provided by the Virginia Audubon Society. This is the structure of the forest, and it shows how birds, different types of birds, live in different levels of the canopy, those that live above the canopy, those in the main canopy, and then mid-story birds. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I recommend a program we put on about birds, and I will mention other programs that we've put on, and there's much more information about it there. So trees are really vital in cleaning our air and water. We humans are pretty sloppy with the air and water that we depend on. And trees absorb odors and pollutant gases. They filter particles out of the air and trap them in the leaves and bark. Trees can absorb carbon dioxide. They remove and store the carbon while releasing oxygen back into the air. And in 1 year, an acre of mature trees can absorb the same amount of carbon dioxide as you produce when you drive your car 26,000 miles. And I don't know about you, I don't usually drive that much in a year. So trees allow water to filter slowly into the soil, prevent it from running off and creating erosion. And the roots take up that moisture and hold it in the soil. When forests are not when they're inadequately regenerated, it leads to erosion and loss of soil. Competing invasive plants can prevent native tree reproduction. So it also prevents some of these important systems from taking place. So we do want to keep out the invasive plants from our environment. Trees can communicate. Trees are connected through underground fungal networks. They send distress signals about drought, disease, and insect pests. They share water and nutrients. And the fungi around their roots take up about 30% of the sugars that the tree produces. And in return for that food, they provide trees with nitrogen, phosphorus, and the minerals that they need to grow. Young saplings are nurtured and survive through this support network. And trees can also communicate through the air via pheromones. And this information comes from a book by Peter Wollenben, a German. He's written The Hidden Life of Trees. But there's also an article in the Smithsonian Magazine. And I have all these in a bibliography. You do not need to write down all this information. If you're interested, at the end of the program, you can contact our help desk and we will send you a bibliography of this information. Okay, so you're ready to plant. The first thing you need to look at is your soil. It is the basic building block of our entire environment. Soil is a very complex structure. It has inorganic matter. There is a microherd, as it's called. It's the bacteria, the algae, the fungi, the protozoa that live in the soil. And as well as that, there are larger living organisms, insects, small animals. There are plant roots, and then there's organic, decaying plant and animal matter, which can be some of the most important things that you have in your soil. Poor, compacted soil contains less than 1% organic matter. And that can really impact all the plants you have in your yard, from the grass right up to the tallest tree. If it's compacted, the water runs off and doesn't reach the roots of the plant and causes stress to the plant, and then the minerals that are in the soil will be unavailable. I'm not going to dwell more on this, but if you'd like to see more about soil and protecting soil, we have a program called Cover Crops on our YouTube channel. So the first step you want to take is test your soil. You should test your soil every 3 years to check the pH. This is true whether you're planting trees or grass or anything else. In Prince William County, you send an email with your name and address to mastergardener@pwcgov.org. It's the same place you registered for this class. In Prince William County, we'll mail you a kit, and then you can mail it to Virginia Tech for $10 a sample. In other counties, check with your local extension office to see how they handle it. And if you live in another state, then contact your state extension office. And if you don't know how to contact them, you can contact our help desk and we can help you figure it out. Now, some trees do thrive in clay soil. You'll hear people say, oh, I have clay soil, it's terrible soil. It's not necessarily terrible. What is terrible is if it's heavily compacted. And it's not the nutrients that are in the soil, but whether the tree can actually access those nutrients. So think before you plant. Site selection. A tree is a tremendous investment in time and money, and you'll find out more about that as we go along. This is in my neighborhood. This poor sycamore is not going to make it. This is some horribly compacted soil. Check for drainage. Dig a test hole as deep as you plan to plant your tree and fill it with water. And then check it in an hour. If it is not draining at 1 inch an hour, you're going to need to choose a different site or plant something that doesn't mind sitting in a puddle of water. We always say, right plant, right place. Think before you plant. Know the space available. So if you live in a townhouse, you've got a different set of needs than if somebody has 10 acres. Know the mature size of your trees. Trees do not like to be moved. Yes, they can be moved, but it always causes stress, and the older and more mature the tree, the more difficult it would be to move it, and with any kind of success. That's not true of shrubs and annuals and perennials, but trees really are different. You want to make sure you have the right kind of light. Is it full sun? Is it part sun? And part sun and part shade are sort of the same thing, but it depends on the type of sun, morning or afternoon. You want to check for your exposure to wind, to harsh weather. Check for overhead and underground power lines, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of slides. Septic fields. You don't want to plant a tree on a septic field, and for some trees, you don't even want to plant them close to a septic field. You can see in this slide in the bottom left-hand corner that what happens when trees are too close to a fence. And the next picture is one that's a community center here in Manassas, and this poor tree keeps having to be chopped back because it's planted way too close to that door. And then these 2 slides on the bottom right is actually my house. And 8 years ago when I moved in, this little crepe myrtle looked very appropriate for the space, but obviously the builder did not take into consideration what would happen. And I do not top crepe myrtles. You should never do that. So I just have to keep it pruned, but this picture is outside my house right now. It's what it looks like right now. And somebody else who did not consider their space. So group trees together. This can create tree islands, and if you mulch in an island shape, then you're less likely to run your lawnmower into the tree, although as you can see in this one on the left, someone has, these are all in my neighborhood too. If you're going to group them in an island, again, check the size. This is a sycamore amidst some eastern red cedars, and the sycamore looks like it's reaching out, crying, help me, help me. You want to do a mix of shrubs and trees. It can be an interesting look to have shrubs, but again, make sure they're compatible once they're fully grown. Do some research. These are two very good sources. One is The Essential Native Trees and Shrubs of the Eastern United States by Tony Dove and Ginger Woolridge. It's a beautiful book with lovely color pictures. It tells you what soil pH for all these plants need. And it also tells you the water needs, the light needs. It's a great resource, not to mention it's pretty. Common Native Trees of Virginia is put out by the Virginia Department of Forestry. You can get it free in PDF online. And again, it's in the bibliography, but you can Google Common Native Trees of Virginia, Department of Forestry, and it'll pop up. I use a source called the Missouri Botanical Garden Plant Finder. Now, it's Missouri and I'm in Virginia, but I select plants based on information about my native plants. But you can go to the Missouri Botanical Garden after you've made a selection, and it has a beautiful synopsis of all the features of the trees, the culture, problems, insect pests, diseases, and places to use it in your garden. So it's a good synopsis to look at to kind of double check, is this plant right for the place that I'm choosing it? And do check disease and pest resistance. Even native plants have diseases and pests. So you want to be aware and know what you're facing. Why do we plant native trees? Because they make a difference in our habitat. Here in Prince William County, we're in Zone 7. If you don't live here, just check your zone. Make sure you know your zone before you plant a tree. We have a resource here called Plant Nova Natives, and you can just Google plantnovanatives.org, and you will find this book. It is available online in a PDF form, or you can purchase it. I think it's very inexpensive. I don't remember how much it costs. Native plants do make a difference for native birds and for insects and butterflies. They're adapted to our climate. They don't need pesticides or fertilizer. And all trees will absorb the runoff, but native plants make a difference. So please choose native plants. Now I'm going to go through a number of plants. I'm not going to read you all this information. I got this information out of the books I mentioned, and I got the information and I checked it on the Missouri Plant Finder. This tree, one of my favorites, a little serviceberry. Look at its beautiful fall color. It's not very tall. And do remember, when you see these numbers, like, so the sweet bay magnolia can get to 35 feet. A lot depends on where you place it and whether it has, if it's in a crowded situation, it may not grow as tall and it may not spread as widely as these numbers indicate. This beautiful sweet bay magnolia has fragrant white flowers in the spring. And if you're interested in rain gardens, it's a plant you can use in the rain garden. It tolerates clay and wet soil. The little serviceberry here will tolerate acidic soil and medium water. The eastern redbud, you see it everywhere in the spring. It has these beautiful pink blossoms. It's a very tolerant plant. It lives in my neighborhood, so it's tolerant of clay soil, deer. And I'll talk a little bit later about the black walnut and why that's important. So this is another tree in my neighborhood. It's a wax myrtle and has these pretty waxy berries that the birds just adore. So if you want to attract birds, it's a lovely tree. It's very small. It won't grow very tall, and it doesn't have a wide spread. And it's also very tolerant. The American smoke tree. I had never seen a smoke tree until I moved into this neighborhood, and I just love its color. And this is another one that's very tolerant. And the American holly is a beautiful tree, and of course it produces berries. It does require you to have a male and a female in order to produce berries, but a couple more for small spaces. Everyone in Virginia knows our beautiful flowering dogwood. Sadly, it is sometimes gets dogwood anthracnose, so you may need a resistant variety. It's a cultivar called Cornus crusa, which is more resistant, but if you want to plant one, go for it and see if you can care for it and that it won't get the disease. The witch hazel, the really reason I added witch hazel is because so many of the ones I've mentioned have a bloom time in the summer. The witch hazel blooms in the fall, so it provides alternative color. And I wish I had a larger yard, because I would put one in mine. Now we're getting into larger spaces. Now notice that these vary greatly in how large they become based on the space they have. But the eastern red cedar you saw in that slide that had the sycamore squished between it can get quite wide. It can spread quite widely. It'll tolerate all kinds of soil. And it's amazing. It's one of the first plants that you see sprouted in abandoned fields. The birds eat the berries and spread them widely. They're everywhere. But if you want to grow apple trees or quince trees, it's not recommended because they share a disease called apple cedar rust, because it's not technically a cedar, it's a juniper, but it suffers from that. So I should say the eastern red cedar does not suffer from it, but the apple trees will. The sweet gum, many people don't like it because it sheds these messy, spiky little balls, but it's a beautiful tree and has lovely fall color, and it's tolerant of just about everything: deer, clay, wet soil, black walnuts. So more trees for larger spaces. The river birch, again, it's a native and it has quite a lot of height and spread to it. What's really good about it is it will sop up water amazingly, but it can be messy. So if you don't tolerate trees that drop things, it's probably not the tree for you, but it will tolerate just about everything, and it doesn't mind polluted air. It doesn't mind wet soil. It can tolerate the black walnuts. The sassafras. I love the sassafras. It's a very underutilized tree. It's native. It's sometimes hard to find, but it's another tree that will tolerate quite a few different things, and it's gorgeous in the fall. It says it has blooms, but it's not something you'd really notice. You wouldn't think of it as a blooming tree. More trees for very large spaces. The pin oak. Now in my neighborhood, in the townhouses, the builder planted these in front of townhouses. I would not recommend that. They get to be very, very tall and they have a very wide spread. But again, they're very tolerant, and if you have the space for them, they can be quite beautiful. The white oak is one of the best trees to plant if, and it's a big if, you have a large amount of space. This tree is home to so many different caterpillars, and it's a favorite tree of a lot of birds. It can tolerate a lot of different things, rocky, dry soil. They're beautiful trees, but here again, you need to have it in the right place. So the red maple, not quite as large as those oaks, but it does take up a lot of room. And in the fall, it has the most gorgeous color, and it will tolerate medium to wet soil. It'll tolerate wetter soil than many other plants will. It doesn't mind part shade. And again, it's another one that can tolerate that black walnut. The bitternut hickory, I had to add a hickory to this list, even though it's not one that you see very often in people's yards. They do have very hard nuts that come crashing down, but it's a magnificent tree, and it's a very, very hardy once it's established. The tulip poplar, another tree. Don't plant it unless you have a really large space. But if you have acreage, there's nothing more beautiful. They really are magnificent trees. And the American beech, I've just learned they suffer from, I don't know if it's a new disease, but I've just learned about it. They suffer from a disease. So you might want to do a little more research on this. They are beautiful. They start out very small, but they can get gigantic. Now, this is the unforeseen consequences part of thinking and doing your research. So willow trees, people love them. They're a bit messy, but don't plant them if you don't have a large space away from septic fields and pipes. Their roots will travel for a very long distance, and they will tear up a septic field and break up pipes. So if you have a small suburban yard, don't plant a willow. Pines are in decline in some areas due to our warming climate. You can see this sad Austrian pine in my neighborhood. It's probably been taken down by now. I took these pictures some weeks ago before the tree companies came. The black walnut, I mentioned this several others. Black walnuts are amazing trees. Black walnuts were planted at Montpelier by James Madison. They are still there today. They have amazing tolerance, but, and this is the big but, they produce something called juglone, which can kill nearby plants and trees. So you need to have plants that can tolerate the juglone. So think carefully. And again, it's a huge tree, so you want to make sure you have the space. It can also be messy. These walnuts have a coating on them that when they fall and decay, it's actually been used for centuries as dye, but it's black and oozy and awful. So think about your tolerance for that sort of thing. If you have a wooded area, a large space, that would be fine. The spruce is prone to rhizosphaera, so it's unsuited to Virginia. The Leland cypress is just, in my opinion, plain ugly. It grows to 100 feet tall. It gets very straggly looking. I'm not saying never, but think about that. The ash, our lovely native ash and fringe trees are sadly being decimated by the emerald ash borer. If you've driven anywhere in Virginia, you will see stands of ash that are dead. The fringe tree is not an ash tree, but it's related to the ash tree, and it's beautiful. But here again, think about it, because the emerald ash borer has been known to attack them. Ornamental cherries. You see this bottom left-hand picture, a row of ornamental cherries in my neighborhood have not survived. They were probably planted too deep and they have volcanoes, but ornamental cherries are short-lived and disease-prone. People love them because of their beautiful pink blossoms, and they think of them around the tidal basin in Washington, D.C., but there might not be the best choice for your yard. And I'm not going to talk about fruit trees, but there is a publication from Virginia Tech called Tree Fruit in the Home Garden, and you could learn more about them. They are a lot of work. They do have pests and diseases, so you might want to think about that before you plant. And these are the things we ask you, please, please do not plant. These are invasive species. You see them everywhere, but they're invading our woodlands and they are taking over from our native trees. The Bradford or Callery pear, the tree of heaven, the mimosa or silk tree, the princess tree or royal paulownia, and that's when you see it has purple blossoms and it's all along the highways everywhere. The Norway maple, the white poplar, the chinaberry, the white mulberry, and the paper mulberry. These are I got these lists from plant invaders of the mid-Atlantic. Now, where to buy trees? We're not recommending any particular place. I just made a list of some local nurseries. Merrifield Garden Center has several branches in our area. Meadow Farms Nursery, Lake Ridge Nurseries, and Woodbridge. Remember, even reputable nurseries will sell invasive species. So do your homework, and even though these garden centers may have very knowledgeable staff, you want to come with your own ideas of what you'd like to plant and where you want to plant it. Do your homework first. You can buy trees online, but it may not be the best option. You don't get to see it and check and see if it's healthy before it arrives. So I'm not saying don't, but just think about it. So we have native plant nurseries in Virginia: Watermark Woods, Nature by Design, Earth Sangha, Hummingbird Hill, Hill House Farm and Nursery. With a lot of the native plant nurseries, they're not open year round, so you would want to check with them, look online, and check with them before you go to purchase something. So do you have to purchase? No, you can find seedlings. All 4 of these are growing in my tiny little townhouse yard. If you do this, you want to dig deeply and get all the roots. Now, here's a sycamore, a tulip poplar, a maple, and an oak, and they're all going to have to come out because I don't have room for them. But planting them, you probably need a little extra care to make sure that they will survive. I'm not going to go into how to create your own seedlings, but you can Google hardwood cuttings for shrub and tree propagation. For Clemson University, their extension program has an excellent article on how to do this. Also, it's in one of our other programs, but basically you would need to cut a small branch, a new branch, and then you dip it in rooting powder, put it in some rooting medium, and then leave it. It doesn't need a lot of light, but it does need regular moisture in order to propagate. Okay, so you've made your decision. You know what tree you want, and you're going to head to your local garden center. What do you need to look for? You want a young sapling with a flexible trunk. You want one that's not root bound in a pot or with a root ball that's too small. You want one that's planted not deeply in the pot. You want to be able to see the root flare, and this is what we mean by the root flare. This one is probably not salvageable, the one on the top right. It's so root bound, it doesn't look like it's going to make it. This one could possibly, you can probably trim those roots, spread them out, and it might make it. This poor baby here, planted way too deeply, its roots are suffocating. It can't get the air it needs. It's probably not going to do well. You want to make sure it's not strangled by ropes and wires, that there are no broken branches or damaged bark. And I've already mentioned the circling roots. You also want one with a single leader, and I will mention that again. So when do you plant? Obviously, this poor baby didn't make it. Late fall and early winter gives a tree the best chance of survival. New trees take a beating in the heat. You see this all the time. You drive down the road and you'll see developments or office buildings, and it's the middle of August. And now this August we've had a lot of rain, but in ordinary August we've not had much rain, and they're planting trees all down the highway. And it always makes me sad because I think they're not going to make it. So in fall and winter, trees don't expend energy on growing leaves, and all the tree's energy goes into root growth. And root growth is essential to this tree surviving. In spring and summer, the foliage requires extra moisture, which necessitates more watering. It's not that it can't survive if planted in spring and summer, but you're giving it a much better chance if you wait until the fall. And I got this information from an article from the Piedmont Master Gardeners called Planting a New Tree, and that's in the bibliography as well. Now, you've made your selection, you've been to the garden center, you've gotten the plant you want. What's your next step? Call Miss Utility. Here it's dial 811, or you can just go online and you can schedule for them to come out, and they can mark any underground utilities around your house. This is essential because I have seen where utility companies, it's not usually the power companies, but it's the cable companies. They're lazy. They just dig a few inches into the ground, slap that cable down, and then cover it over and walk away. If you don't know it's there and you start to dig for your tree, you're going to lose your cable. So the hole, dig a hole 2 to 4 times as wide as your root ball. As you can see in this diagram, nice wide hole with sloping sides allows the tree roots to spread out and take hold. If the soil is heavily compacted, you want to dig a wider area. The depth of the hole should be a few inches shallower than the root ball. And that's very important because you do not want to plant a tree too deeply. You want to create, and you can see down underneath this tree, you're going to create a pedestal and you're going to set the tree on that. You're not going to set it on with any wire or things. I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. And you score the sides of the hole so that the roots can branch out into the hole. This is where we talk about codominant leaders. You want to select the right tree so it doesn't have this, but if it does, you can prune away one of them, crossing branches, anything with too narrow a crotch. I will mention again in the next couple of slides what to fill the hole with, but you want to make sure there's nothing tying up this tree. This is a tree that was planted by professionals, and they didn't remove this tie. You want to remove everything: plastic, fiber pots, burlap, wires, pins, ropes, tags, tapes, label, anything that could constrict that tree's growth. You're going to cut through it, the encircling roots in a few places to prevent girdling, and mentioned this earlier. This is one that's not pot bound, but it might have a few that are circling it, and you want to be very gentle in this. You don't want to cut too many roots, but You can cut a few so that it spreads out. You're going to place the root ball in the hole on that pedestal I mentioned in the previous slide, and you're going to check that the root flare, here again, see this one might have been planted too deeply. So the root flare should be above the level of the soil. And here's a burlap wrapped tree that you're going to want to get all of that off. Now, once you have this tree set firmly on your pedestal, you're going to backfill the hole partially to start with. Use no amendments, no fertilizer, no manure. Manure can contain herbicides, believe it or not. Do not put loose soil underneath the root ball, as compaction can cause it to sink, and then your tree will be too deeply planted. Do not use sand. That will decrease the drainage. After you've filled it up about 1/3 to 2/3 of the way, you're going to pour in the water to settle that backfill. And then after you do that, you're going to finish filling up to within 2 inches of the top of the root ball. Now you're going to gently pack that backfill, not tamp it down, but just gently press it in place, because you want the oxygen to remain in between those soil particles to provide the tree roots with oxygen. You are going to make sure, now this picture is not correct. It shows burlap at the bottom. You do not want anything under that tree. Burlap can occasionally be, or probably more than occasionally, be treated so that it does not decompose, and then the tree would not be able to send roots down into the soil. Mulching. Now these are not newly planted trees, but this is what mulch should look like. You should be able to see the flare, and it should be spread out around the tree and should not be more than 2 inches. You want to use an organic mulch rather than a fake mulch, certainly not rubber mulch. You want to say that the top edge of the root ball is covered with mulch and not soil. And you leave 2 inches around the trunk. You can see this one on the bottom. This is another cherry that is not going to make it in my neighborhood. It has a mounded volcano and its damaged trunk. It may not die right away, but it's headed there. Sometimes the roots come to the surface. You're going to want to not cover them. They're there to get air. You can leave them bare, or you can cover them lightly. And then you don't want black plastic or anything else under that mulch. Some people use rocks as mulch. I can say from experience, it's a bad idea because it doesn't obviously decompose, and yet decomposing material gets in between it, and pretty soon you're struggling to keep the weeds out. So just use organic mulch that will decompose, and then replace it yearly with another inch, or every couple of years with an inch. Happy tree, sad tree. Can't say that often enough. Another one on mulching. Now, where would you get mulch? In our area, you can request a wood chip drop from Novak. You can just Google that. I have this link here, but don't worry about copying it. If you Google Novak wood chip mulch drop, you can. You don't want that unless you have a very large yard, because it's going to be a big amount of wood chips. If you have a large yard, it's great, and that's free. Prince William County has the Ballsford compost facility where they compost the leaves that the silly people who don't use them in their own yard get rid of them. We say leave the leaves. Leaves are not litter. Now, there's more information on this in our video preparing for fall, but you can see this sad little dogwood is not making it. It has a giant volcano. You can also plant ground covers. We call it living mulch underneath your trees. Shade-tolerant plants that have evolved with the trees are your best bet. Ferns, bleeding heart, wild violets, wild ginger, foam flower. I've added hosta to the list because some people love it. It's not native. Deer eat them, but for some people, it is a solution. If you're a person who likes a pristine lawn, which is not me, but don't plant wild violets. They spread like crazy, but they make a beautiful ground cover, and they're lovely in the spring, and they're food for the fritillaries when they first arrive in the spring. What not to plant under your trees would be grass, English ivy. English ivy can choke a tree, and it's terribly invasive. Pachysandra, which many people have used for years, but it's becoming very invasive, vinca, and ajuga. Now, this poor little tree, what I suspect, unless the homeowner is going to come out and trim that grass with scissors, is going to use a string trimmer and cut that bark, and that tree will be gone. I can't say this enough. Water, 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 water. Trees need water. Get a rain gauge and pay attention to the rain. I pulled this image off of Amazon. It costs $3 or $4. They're very inexpensive. Saplings need more water than older trees. Once they're established, they don't need as much water, but they still need water. Water 1 inch 2 times a week for the first month, and then water regularly once a week after the first month for a year. These two sad examples in my neighborhood did not get the water they needed. A young tree may go into shock, so you may plant it and you think, well, why is it not growing? I've done all the right things. Well, we have a saying, sleep, creep, leap. So for the first year, this tree is in a little bit of shock. It's trying to get used to its new location. It may not grow much at all. But as long as you keep it watered and you don't do anything drastic to it, it's just getting established, growing its roots. The second year we call the year of creeping. So it creeps upward slightly. It'll get more leaves. It'll grow a few more branches. It's just getting settled. And then the third year should be its leap, the year that it leaps ahead and begins to grow very steadily. Don't worry if that first year it doesn't grow much, because that's normal. By the time a tree shows stress, the damage is done. Nobody's going to say, this tree was just planted in my neighborhood a few months ago, and that's what it looks like. It was planted last fall. More about watering. Water past the drip line. This is a picture that shows the roots extend 2 to 3 times beyond the canopy. Make it easy on yourself. Get a drip hose and put it out there and just let it slowly soak. If you don't have one, and you can use a bucket with holes in the bottom, so you put the bucket out there on the tree roots, fill it up, a big bucket, like a 5-gallon one, fill it up with water and let it seep through the holes in the bucket and seep into the ground. Trees on a slope are going to need more water. You can build a berm of soil to keep that water in. And lawn irrigation is not enough for your trees. So you don't want to depend on your lawn sprinkler. You want to make sure you have that drip going so that it soaks deeply into the water zone. Some trees need more water than others, and maples are an example of that. If you're going to go away for a while and your tree is struggling and you know it's going to be a hot, dry period, you can temporarily use one of these, something like this gator bag, but it's a temporary solution. It's not a long-term solution. You want to remove it when you come back home. The water should reach 6 to 12 inches deep into the soil. And an old Malay proverb says, a tree with strong roots laughs at storms. And that's what you want, a tree with strong roots. Okay, you've planted it, you've done everything right. Now, to stake or not to stake? So, young trees without stakes grow stronger, establish roots faster, have shorter, sturdier trunks. Staked trees have thinner trunks, less lateral root development, and they're higher risk of the trunks breaking, and they can fall over after the stakes are removed. The wind allows a tree to sway, and that stimulates ethylene and growth hormones, which promote additional growth of wood fibers in the lower part of the trunk. You will have a stronger tree if you don't stake it. And this came from our Robin Feinot, another gardener who does a gardening blog, and it's called Mythbusters, Should Trees Be Staked? Now, sometimes you do need to stake. If you bought a bare root tree or one that had a small root ball, you may need it there until lateral roots start to form. Large evergreen trees that are in a high wind zone might be a good idea to stake, but just until their lateral roots have formed. Open sites exposed to strong winds. Now, these are two that I think. A tall tree with an undersized root ball, don't buy that tree. A very weak trunk that's top heavy, don't buy that tree either. But if you do, stake it. When you stake, you're going to stake outside the root ball. You're going to use padding on the wire, and you can see from this picture that it had padding, but they didn't remove it in soon enough time, and it has begun to girdle the trunk. That'll probably survive, but it's not a good plan. Remove those ties after 1 season and put the ties no higher than 2/3 the height of the trunk. Now, if you live in Virginia, deer can be a problem unless you live in a fenced yard or something with a very high fence, because deer can get over fences. So you will want to protect your young trees, and this tree has a wire cage. Deer will rub their antlers on the trunk, stripping the bark. They can eat the bark in the winter when they can't find other food. They can decimate a forest of young seedlings. So imagine what they can do to your 1 or 2 seedlings. I do love this one. This is my neighbor. She is protecting it very carefully. There is more information about dealing with deer in your yard in a YouTube video that was produced by our master gardeners. Common causes of poor establishment: planting too deeply. That goes back to the make the hole 2 to 3 inches shorter than the depth of your root ball. This reduces oxygen, prevents water penetration and access to nutrients. Underwatering, that'll dry out your tree. Overwatering, root rot. Overmulching. Stressed plants will be subject to insect and fungal diseases. And studies have shown that professionally planted trees are planted too deeply 90% of the time. I can vouch for that in my neighborhood. Virginia Tech I got these guidelines from the Virginia Tech Tree and Shrub Planting Guidelines publication. In my bibliography, I will tell you more about how you can access those publications, and from Plant It Right by Paige Thacker. Pruning. So you shouldn't need to prune a tree right when you plant it, but just in case there's a broken branch or you need to do some pruning, here's the guidelines. Sterilize the pruners with 9:1 water bleach solution. Keep your pruners sharp. Tool sharpening tutorials, you can find them online. Prune broken or dead branches, because that can lead to disease. Prune your codominant leader, and I've mentioned this before. You want it to have a strong single lead at the top of the tree. I'll mention branch collars again. The branch collar is very vital. The branch collar is right here where the branch comes out of the tree. You never want to cut that when you're pruning. This would be a small branch. This would be a larger branch where you're going to make 3 cuts, and the last one close to the edge of the branch collar, but not in it. This is what happens when pruning goes awry. You should prune during dormancy, but it isn't always possible. You do not want to leave stubs. Here again, this is the branch collar. This is the branch collar. And this stub is an invitation to disease. You want to prune out crossing branches. This is a redbud tree, and I have no idea what they did when they pruned this, but all these branches are intertwined, and it's a mess. You want to take out water sprouts. These are suckers or water sprouts, and you want to take those out from around your tree. This is my last on pruning, but again, can't say it often enough. This is the branch collar. This is a properly pruned tree that is growing over some more and then finally healed. Do you need to seal this with those ubiquitous things you can buy in the store that say, use this to heal cuts? No, you do not. If you have made the cuts properly, the tree will heal itself. And I got that information from another of our Teaching Garden blogs, Should Pruning Cuts and Wounds Be Sealed, if you want to read further. We have the 3 Ds of planting: diseased, damaged, and dead. Dead and diseased branches expose the tree to invading insects and diseases. Dead branches on large trees can be hazardous, and disease can spread from one tree to the next, so you want to be sure you take care of them. Okay, humans. Humans do as much damage as wildlife. This is string trimmer damage. This is herbicide damage on a pretty little Japanese maple. I think this was hit by either a car or a lawnmower, and I don't know what happened here. It could have been string trimmer damage, but humans do as much damage as wildlife. You've taken all this time to plant your tree. Take good care of it. Once your tree starts to grow, you're going to want to check for damage and disease. You'll see the damage in branches, in leaves. When you find, and in the stems, when you find damage like this, the first step is to get a correct diagnosis. You want to know, why is this happening to my tree? Early diagnosis can prevent bigger problems. Many problems can be handled without pesticides. And if it's a very small amount, you can just prune it out and put it in the trash. You don't want to compost it because you don't want to spread that disease among other trees. But the most important advice I can say is get a correct diagnosis. You can contact your local extension office. Our office is the same one you contacted to get the link to this program, Master Gardener at pwcgov.org. Don't worry if you didn't write that down because it's going to appear again. After you plant, monitor for pests. Not every pest is going to kill your tree. A few examples, here's that black walnut again with caterpillars in it. It's probably not going to do that any harm. This is another tree with caterpillars in it. This is a bagworm on an eastern red cedar. They can do significant damage, but if you're vigilant and remove them, if the tree is too tall and you can't remove them easily, then you can use BT. But again, you have to do it at the right time of year or it's pointless because they're protected in those cases and you won't affect them at all. Some pests, sadly, are fatal. This is the emerald ash borer, which is killing all our ash trees. You want to know what the pest is so you know how to treat it. Get a diagnosis before you treat. Again, contact your local extension office. For us in Prince William, it's Master Gardener at pwcgov.org. And finally, nothing lives forever. When a large tree dies, call an arborist unless you have expertise in taking down large trees. It can be very dangerous. Two ways you can contact an arborist. The International Society of Arborists is treesaregood.org, and the Mid-Atlantic chapter, which is goodtreecare.com. And again, you can email our office if you don't get this down, and we can help you with that. I'm not going to read through this, but this is 24 Ways to Kill a Tree, one of my favorite publications done by Bonnie Appleton at Virginia Tech. And in it, it mentions all the things I have mentioned about the tree. I don't know that I can emphasize enough, don't top the tree. That encourages water sprouts. To encourage water sprouts, that just weakens the tree and encourages pests. Professionals do it all the time to crepe myrtles, then you should never do it. So this is the rest of the list. We've already mentioned making sure to plant properly and to prune properly, but those are the ways to kill your tree. So when you can contact us at the help desk, Master Gardener at pwcgov.org. I can't say that one often enough. We also have a phone number, 703-792-7747, but we are not in the office right now. I left this on the slide because this presentation will be posted on our YouTube channel. And after the COVID crisis is over, we will be back in our office. But right now, we're not monitoring that phone. It's in our office and no one's there. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our upcoming programs are fall bulbs. Then on the 9th, because of the holiday weekend, we have no class. And then on the 16th of September, we have fall vegetable gardens, then bluebirds, climate change, and resilience urban trees. This is a part of the bibliography I mentioned. You don't need to write this down, but do take note of ext.vt.edu. That's where you can find lots of, this is just a very small list of publications you can find there. These are about trees, but you can find them about all different topics. If you go to ext.vt.edu and you just type in trees, you don't have to be specific, it will give you a list. These are specific ones. You can also put in that number and it will come up. Our YouTube channel has archived classes, and these are just a list of some of them. I think I got most of them down. I mentioned dealing with deer and getting ready for fall, but there's alternatives to turf, ground covers, native birds, and that's the one where you'll find more about that bird chart that I just mentioned briefly. Okay, this is a bibliography of books. You don't have to write this down. You can send to us and we will email you our bibliography. And that's the end. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Okay, we've got several questions. First, a couple comments. Somebody mentioned that Bartlett had saved their trees from emerald ash borers. There are emerald ash borer treatments. They just have to be done every year. That's something to keep in mind when you make the decision, do I want to treat or do I want to get rid of the tree? Someone mentioned that Tree of Heaven or Atlantis is a breeding ground for spotted lanternfly, which is an up-and-coming pest here in Virginia. It is one of many, but there are lots of reasons to get rid of Tree of Heaven. The fact that it's a breeding ground for. How do you know when to give up on a struggling tree when there's no obvious sign of disease?
I don't know that I can answer that for you. I think so much of growing plants involves intuition. And what I would do is get some advice. If you're not sure, you can send us at the Master Gardener email address, you can send us pictures. And if the person at the help desk doesn't know, we pass that around among the experts. And I think sometimes it's in your heart. I had a magnificent pin oak in front of my house and I did everything I could to save it. And after many, many years of coddling it, I had to give up and it gave up the ghost. But here again, you do the best you can with it. And then sometimes it's out of your hands.
And sometimes it may be nutritional. It may be something with the soil. It may be a pH issue. It could be simple things, but I would agree with Jan that sometimes you just know it's time. It's time. How do you tell the difference between a Norway maple and a silver maple? Look at the leaves. I think that was mentioned in the comment, but there's a stark difference between leaf shape.
And any of the books that I mentioned, that those trees, I have another one that's called, I think it's called Essential Trees of North America. And if you have any of these resources, you can look up the trees and leaves and see and the comparisons.
How old is too old when buying trees?
That's a good question. I once went to a presentation on trees that said trees should be no more than 3 years old. But the thing I don't know is how you tell if you go to a nursery. The one thing I would say is when you talk to the nursery people, ask them, go with your knowledge. I would like either one of these 2 or 3 trees. Be prepared. And then ask them, of these trees, which one came in recently? And they're usually pretty honest. These were delivered this week. And if they're recently delivered trees, then they're probably the younger ones. You don't want ones that have sat in the background for months and months. But that being said, I have many times picked up a plant at a nursery that's in there, we're going to dump it out tomorrow bin, and you can survive. I forget the name of it. There's a garden in, I think it's in North Carolina, where this gentleman has created a whole garden out of plants that were discarded by plant centers. He just nursed them back to health and they're fabulous.
Why do mushroom circles grow underneath my trees?
I'm going to take a wild stab at rain and more rain. I've noticed that in my neighborhood this spring and summer, we've just had so much rain and I've seen them.
To start with, there's so much fungus in the soil to begin with, especially in an area that's got a lot of trees. Mushrooms are the fruiting bodies of fungi. And so when the conditions are right for fungi to spread, the mushrooms will form, they'll send out spores. And so it's not really a problem. We see a lot of mushrooms when it's really wet, but not necessarily just when it's really wet. There are some turf diseases that are considered diseases, but I wouldn't necessarily consider them a bad thing. But really, it doesn't harm the plant. It doesn't harm the grass. The only time I'd be worried about mushrooms is if you have a tree that's in decline and you start seeing a lot of mushrooms, not necessarily in a circle, but a lot of mushrooms underneath the tree. That could be a sign that there's some rot going on underneath. So our next question is, I have anthracnose on my silver maple. What can I do to prevent it next year?
Well, and I'm going to let Thomas add to this because I might not have a complete answer, but I do know that you want to make sure that the falling leaves are raked up, bagged, and not composted, because it takes it up through the roots and it appears in the leaves. It's in a lot of different trees. The sycamores in my neighborhood all have it. It goes back into the soil from the leaves. So keeping leaf litter cleaned up, and that is an exception to that rule of leave the leaves.
It really depends on the plant. There are some, like dogwoods, have a type of anthracnose that can be lethal, but most anthracnose isn't going to really kill a mature tree. Cleaning up leaf litter is really the best thing you can do. Most of the time, trees are too big to think about trying to put some sort of preventative fungicide down, and even if you were to do that, you'd have to do it all the time, and it wouldn't come close to being cost effective. So I'd rake up the leaves and understand too that a healthy mature tree, even if it gets anthracnose, it's still going to leaf out. I mean, I've seen sycamores leaf out 4 or 5 times in a year, not be really affected in the following few years. So it's possible to just kind of let it be and it'll sort of solve itself. Next question is Yoshino cherry ornamental? Yes, it's considered ornamental. What trees damage foundations?
What a good question. Here again, you want to plant a tree far away from foundations. And again, I'm going to refer to Thomas because he knows far more than I do, but I don't think that silly crepe myrtle outside my window is damaging the foundations. If that was a giant oak, maybe. You just don't plant trees close to the houses. I haven't cut mine down because I like it, but I do recognize that at some point in its life, it may become overwhelming and have to go.
Yeah, I'm a firm believer that, you look at what the mature size of this tree is, how wide is it supposed to be? If you're planting it any closer than the radius, what that radius is out from the mature tree, then you're probably at some point going to have some sort of trouble. There are some trees that are a little more aggressive, especially those trees that are looking for water. Silver maples have a tendency to do that. There's some others, but it's just a good idea to really plant as far away from the foundation as you really can, especially with bigger trees.
And remember that tree sends out roots beyond the crown. And you don't want the tree, like I have to clean out my gutter all the time because of the crepe myrtle. You don't want to have that hassle. You don't want the branches overhanging the house. It's just a problem with trees that are really close to a house.
What predictable problems would you expect if you are planting a tree in a place where you previously planted a tree? I'm assuming this refers to tree has died, we've cut it down, we're replacing it. What can we expect?
I'm not even sure how to answer that. I mean, one of the things that as the old tree, the roots rot, that does provide nutrients if it had a disease. I'm not sure, Thomas, does that transfer the disease to the new tree?
Yeah, it depends on the disease. Generally, the rule of thumb is that if you've had a plant that's had problems, you don't replant that same plant or that same family in that spot. They're going to have the same problems in most cases. It's just not worth it. If you switch to a different family that doesn't have the same disease profiles, then it's probably not a bad thing. The hardest thing really is that you've got to deal with all those roots that are underground and grinding the stump really well. Somebody said 2 of their 5 cherries have their leaves turning yellow and they are losing their leaves. Why is this happening?
Here again, your best bet on that is to send some pictures. If you're in Prince William County, send them to us at the help desk and we'll take a look at it. there's probably so many things that it could be. It's hard to say. And if you send pictures of like the root flare, so we can see, is it mulched? Is there damage to the trunk? Show us the whole tree and then a close-up of the leaves, and then we can take a look at it and decide. It's sort of impossible to know from just that.
Someone in Western Pennsylvania said that well-established trees have been dying due to the August drought and are wondering if we have the same issue here in Virginia. I would start by saying that they didn't die because of the August drought. There are a number of trees that we are seeing decline in as climate changes and we have drier summers. We are having issues with them here in Prince William County, throughout Northern Virginia. And it's not something that's happening overnight. It's years of abuse, whether that's lack of water, whether that's being poorly maintained, or whether that's, sometimes with mature trees, if there's a lot of construction by it and the compaction will damage some of the roots. So I would say that the drought is only one symptom of what's going on with these trees. As Jan mentioned earlier, trees generally don't show immediate damage. They show damage after a while, and the bigger the tree is, the more mature it is, generally speaking, the longer it takes for that damage to show.
It's very sad that we're losing so many trees, and that's why we're asking you to all go out and plant a tree.
How do I get rid of black walnut that sprouts right next to your established plants?
Dig it up.
That would be my suggestion too. If you catch them early enough, it's really easy to hand pull most tree sprouts. I have squirrels that drive me nuts because they plant locust trees in my backyard and they plant mulberry trees. For me, it's a weekly task of going through and seeing what sprouted and pulling it up. So that's the best way, I would say, because you're never going to stop squirrels from moving seeds around, and you just have to be observant for it.
And don't do like I've done with those in my front yard, because they do have to come up. I'm trying to see if I can salvage them for our native plant sale.
One last question. We have English ivy under stand of hemlocks and a blue spruce. The ivy is contained by a hardscape, and I can prevent the ivy of I can prevent the ivy from growing up the trees. Can I keep the ivy?
That's up to you. I mean, everyone has to make their own decisions about their own garden. Even though I mentioned that ajuga is it's not a good thing to plant. I have some in my yard. It's in a very contained space. It doesn't get out of control. If you are willing to control it, my understanding is that it can harbor insect pests and some diseases, and Thomas, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's up to you. If your tree is hardy and it's not growing up the tree and it's not, getting out of control, that's your choice. It's your garden.
Yeah, so the thing about invasives is that they're a problem when they're let loose, but if you've got them contained and can manage containing them, it's not a big deal. I think that if you like the ivy and you want to keep it, and it's controlled by hardscape, and you just keep it, off the trees, a lot of times it's not a problem. Ivy will extend its roots, and depending on what your hardscapes are, it may escape those hardscapes at some point. But again, if you're observant and monitoring for that, it should be fine. The one thing I would caution is that even though English ivy is not considered poisonous, it does have there are some people who are very sensitive to it. So if you're going to be pulling ivy off of your trees, make sure you're wearing gloves.
Thank you, everyone who's left. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next time. If you enjoyed this video, please let us know with your questions, comments, and suggestions. You can reach us at mastergardener@pwcgove.org. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.